Many of you are probably aware that we've been doing a series where we go through and categorize all of everyone within Marvel Rivals within the respective roles. Because while there may be tanks, the way that the tanks do their tanking is a little bit different. Same with the DPS, same with the supports. But as this is an ongoing process, there's some things that I feel like I got wrong, and I feel like it is sort of my responsibility, being that we even got cited by a rather large account, to go back through and talk about some stuff that I feel like I got wrong. We're constantly learning, growing, and discovering, so here are 10 corrections to the categories of heroes within Marvel Rivals. I also will use this video to talk about the Thing and the Human Torch, because even though they've only been out for a little bit, let's be honest, they're pretty clear what they're trying to do. So the very first thing I want to discuss is the addition of a fourth category within the tanks. Now, if you watched the video, you probably know where this is going, but let me just catch everybody up to speed. I talked about that there are 3 main tank categories: Brawl, Dive, and Anchor, and I argued that Penny was an Anchor tank and a Brawl tank, 80-20. And I even admitted in that video, that's probably not right, but we don't really have a great category for her because there's just not enough tanks that fit her style. I was hoping that the Thing would kind of help fill up that category, but nah, dude's like through and through a Brawl tank, so that didn't really end up working out. So instead, let's just go ahead and just retroactively add this to Penny. Penny is a bunker tank. Now, bunker tanks are a little bit different than what she was previously, where Anchor wants to play around long-term sustain and barriers and such, and I also argued that she was a little bit Brawl just because of her damage. Bunker tanks instead rely more on longer range, typically, and most notably, they have something that they place down that allows them to control the space. They want to be in the space before the enemy gets there, which is typically why these tanks are much better on defense, because they have tools that naturally make them good at backpedaling. Now, this is where it gets a little bit interesting, because bunker tanks, now when we were talking about like the wheel of counters and such, bunker tanks are good against 2 categories, maybe a softer one on one, but really good against Brawl tanks. Brawl tanks need to get within CQC to deal stuff, and all of these tanks want you to be within CQC, and they even have some range to back it up, including some stuns. So the bunker tanks are even better against the Brawl tanks than what we saw earlier, and in fact, I would argue this is the true counter to them. And they're also not bad against dive tanks, because dive tanks also don't typically have a lot of range. They fare a little bit better than the Brawl tanks because they have more mobility and slightly more range than the Brawl tanks, but not by much. And that also is true of Groot. Groot is also a bunker tank. Previously, I argued that he was 50% Anchor, 50% Brawl, whereas now I'm going to say that he's 50% bunker, 50% Anchor. Yeah, the Brawl stuff kind of transfers over a little bit, but I would argue that he's more of a bunker tank than previously. Obviously, he's building walls. He's got a similar sustain pattern to Penny, where he's getting health from continuing to be in the fight, sort of like how a Brawl operates, but a little bit different. Like, Brawl tanks get it typically more in like bursts and such, whereas Groot and Penny both get it sort of trickled in over a longer period of time as they want to stay planted in that area. All right, cool, moving on. Doctor Strange. I argued that Doctor Strange was 100% an Anchor tank, kinda. This, I think, was a little bit inaccurate, as my system, I try to do things in either the 20-80, 50-50, or 80-20, right? I think it's more correct to say that Strange is probably closer to like a 60-20-20, which is really messy, and I really hate that, but that really does a good job of explaining how versatile he is as a hero. As yes, he is clearly 100% that Anchor tank. He wants to stay planted on a point and stay there for as long as he possibly can, but also he got hands, and he's got good hands and quite a bit of mobility. It just comes in burst. So 100% I would say that Strange tends to fit more in the generalist, kind of doing a little bit of everything, but absolutely dominating as an Anchor tank before doing anything else. Now, I also want to clarify something else. Let's talk about Thor, and not just Thor, but the DPS categories that Thor also softly qualified as, and that is the Brawl category. When we were making both the DPS and the tank video, I talked about the value and how Brawl ends up being played. And a lot of people, when they look at these categories, specifically Brawl, say, well, Brawl's supposed to be the front line, kind of the anchor of the damage, as it were, but that's not how I use this character. Maybe it be Magic or Thor or maybe even, there's quite a bit about Iron Fist as well. They say, I typically flank, and I want to remind people that these categories define how the character plays most of the time. Brawl, of course, can flank, but that's not what they're designed for. Like, it's different than, let's say, Spider-Man. Like, yeah, Spider-Man's got hands too, but he's not trying to duel things on the front line. He's looking. In fact, he has to go find things in the back line. He has to go find a flank, whereas somebody like Iron Fist, Magic, Thor specifically, is much more comfortable with staying right in front of the damage and continuing to stay and deal what they need to deal in order to get their value out. Yes, you can flank with them, but that's not necessarily what they were designed for. Good if you can, but not the end-all be-all for their kits. I'm hoping that makes sense. I wanted to make sure that I clarified that, because I saw quite a few people kind of talking about how Brawls, all of the Brawl particular characters, are a little bit of flank, which is like, yeah, that's true, but that's not the point. All right, next up, let's go into the DPSs. Moon Knight. I argue that Moon Knight was 100% sustain, which I still think that he is a high sustain character, but I think more accurately to him, he is a 80% sustain, 20% poke. I think that he leans a little bit more on longer range than I maybe initially gave him credit for. He still has great mobility tools, which is not super common of poke characters, so that leans him more in the sustain category. And of course, he's got some tools for close range, like good tools, like good high damage tools, which not a lot of the pokes do. This also brings up another thing that I saw. A lot of people potentially thought about having subcategories, which I feel like that's probably very accurate, but not necessarily helpful for the people who are maybe learning how to build a team comp, because Moon Knight is more likely a control character if we were to make that a subcategory, but sustain is already a subcategory of poke, so making subcategories of subcategories of subcategories is probably not the best. The control characters would be people like obviously Moon Knight. I think that Squirrel Girl probably fits in there really, really well. You could argue that the tanks that are bunker tanks kind of fit into that category, but again, I think that's just a little too much. Also, because we're getting the Human Torch, it's been argued that maybe we should have a flyer category, and I think both the control and the flyer subcategory is more of like a tool or like a checklist to them, or maybe a perk, or maybe a passive, maybe you could think of it like that, where it doesn't necessarily change how they interact with the game, but it just gives them a different way of going about it. Does that make sense? All right, cool. Neymar, same situation. Neymar, I argued, was 100% sustain. I think he's more 80% sustain, 20% brawl. Now that brawl might seem a little bit weird to throw on here because he doesn't necessarily like targets in close range, or does he? Because yes, he's got range, and in fact, a lot of people argued he's more kind of in the poke category, but Neymar has something that very few any of the sustain type characters, or even the poke type characters have, which is an invincibility frame, an invincibility window. In fact, when we do look at him as partially brawl, it makes sense why he's so good at taking care of dive and flank type characters, because he has that little bit of thing that he needs to shut them down. Obviously, his turrets kind of want enemies to be sort of close, and that invincibility allows him to hold into a zone and sustain it for as long as he can without going down. So I know it's weird, but I think Neymar actually has that tiny, teeny bit of brawl in his DNA. That is partially why he's so good at countering stuff. And again, the presence of an invincibility window is, I think, even more evidence to that. All right, Scarlet Witch. I am going to apologize to all the Scarlet Witch mains. I had you wrong. I had you so wrong. I have warmed up to Scarlet Witch. I think that she's a lot better than I initially thought. Still not great. Granted, still not great, but she's getting buffs. So, hey, maybe this is the time for the Scarlet Witch. Anyway, I initially put her as a 50-50 sustain brawl, but I think it's probably more accurate to say that she's 80% brawl, 20% flank. She has some stuff that gets her good at flanking. In fact, that whole long period of not being able to be touched probably should include me in initially, that she definitely has more flank. But yeah, I think this is much more appropriate for her to call her more brawl with a little bit of flank, rather than a sustain character that happens to do some brawl every now and then. Again, this is kind of a loose category. Hell, you can even argue that Scarlet Witch is a little bit of everything, and I think that wouldn't be completely wrong either, which also explains why her DPS is kind of not great. Anyway, moving into Wolverine. Wolverine, I said, was 100% brawl, which I firmly stand by, but being that we talked about Mr. Fantastic as being a pseudo-tank, I think it's fair to also talk about Wolverine as being a pseudo-tank. Much less so than Mr. Fantastic, but still worth talking about. If we were to think about him in the sort of tank category, think about him as mostly a dive tank with a bit of brawl. Like, he wants to get in and get targets dead very quickly and then get the heck out. And of course, he's mostly focused around staying in CQC and surviving for as long as he can to dealing damage. So this is just an aside, but I figured it's worth mentioning. Let's move into the supports. This is where I think things get much more different than how I initially had it. The supports, I think, are the hardest to categorize, which when I was going through it, I kind of admitted outright. But I want to talk about 3 in particular, and all of them are playmakers, starting with Jeff. I initially said that Jeff was 80% playmaker, 20% lifeline, but as I've kind of studied him a little bit more, I think it's more accurate to say that he's a 50-50, 50% playmaker, 50% lifeline. Also, a clarity I wanted to make on playmakers is that a lot of people confused the fact that they had consistent healing with like a utility thing. All of the supports heal, guys. All of them do. I got a lot of arguments and comments that were like, well, this character heals really well. Yeah, all of them heal, right? That's kind of what makes them a support, but how they heal is the important thing. Playmakers have more slow, consistent, typically not as stacked healing, like you can't throw multiple heal sources on a target at once, whereas lifelines are like able to pump out a lot of healing in a very short period of time, whereas utilities are more kind of come in bursts and such, right? All right, so anyway, I think it's more accurate to say that Jeff has more lifeline than I initially gave him credit for, but still has those playmaker categories, the good movement speed, the half decent damage, etc. Loki. Initially, I categorized Loki as 100% a playmaker, and even when I was making it, it didn't quite sit right with me, but I decided to kind of like override those thoughts and continue to plow forward. Instead, I think Loki is much more accurately 80% playmaker, 20% utility. That invincibility field that he has is such a utility thing, but still he holds on to a lot of the stuff that makes him a playmaker. Heck, you could argue that maybe Loki is maybe more like a 90-10, but again, I try to keep these categories in like a particular way, so I would argue that he's not the true playmaker of the bunch. Instead, of course, that distinction goes to Rocket. Rocket, I argued in the past, was 80-20 playmaker utility, but I would argue that as I've kind of better internalized, digested and such, I think that Rocket's the 100% playmaker here. He's got the movement speed, his damage is really good up close, his healing is consistent but slow, he can't stack it as well as say Loki can, as our previous counter example. I think that he much more fits into that category of like a true playmaker, which goes to show that playmakers are really good in the meta right now. Like, most playmakers are among the top of like the most win rated heroes right now. But anyway, now let's talk about the Thing. I am trying my best to not make a pun. You can thank me later. So the Thing, as I mentioned earlier, he's 100% a brawl tank. He has so many tools to stay in a fight and continue to throw. Dude is just hands. He's just hands. He's just hands. He's got a little bit of movement speed, but that's mostly to get to teammates and such. But other than that, he's just hands. He wants to throw down lots of damage on the front line of the battlefield. He has things that he has passive that keeps him from getting stunned out so he can continue to do what he needs to do. He is hands. He takes up a lot of space. He is a bowling ball and everyone else looks like pins. 100% brawl tank. Human Torch. When it comes to the category of flying type characters, all of them so far have been at least a little bit of a sustainer, and Human Torch just took that and cranked it up to 103. Somebody will get that joke. Human Torch is just 100% a sustain. His damage is incredible. He wants to stay in the fight for a long period of time. He's got tools for close range too, which is kind of a sustainer thing with that flexible damage. But yeah, 100%. He has so much damage into that area. He's great at taking down groups of enemies all at once, which is what sustainers are so good for. He, of course, has a lot of tools that allowed him to shut down the big ults and such. I don't know how much more I can say this. I know I'm sort of repeating myself, but it's almost shocking how much of a sustainer Human Torch is. He might be the best and purest form of sustain we have thus far, but we'll have to get to see. Obviously, he's got that movement ability, which maybe puts him a little bit into the flanker category, but again, I think that's more of a sustainer thing. You guys can let me know in the comments. All right. And those are my corrections. Feel free to join us up on Discord. We're also running tournaments this Saturday at 8 p.m. Pacific time. If you want to join that, anyone's allowed to join, so feel free. Also join us on Patreon. Trainings every week. It's really cool. Hope you guys enjoyed this. Bless your faces. Deuces.